Now, one of the things I wanted to do is have a real definitive, like, this is how you put your engine together kind of thing. But I did a lot of research on this topic, and it's honestly, it's a real kind of wide and varied field of different things people do, different reasons for doing them. Everyone's kind of follows the same general rules, but everyone has their own ways of doing things. So, you know, someone will say, I put this stuff on first, and then I always do it this way. And someone else might say, yeah, I don't really do it that way. I still do the same things, but I do it in a different order, or I use a different product, or, you know, they say I don't put it on wet, I put it on dry, and then later on I do this. So it's a lot of different takes on kind of doing the same thing. So what I want to do is I'm just going to show how I do it. There's a whole bunch of great videos on YouTube. Honestly, Pete's Garage is one of them. He's got a lot of really good videos on building engines and the reason why he's doing it. He does what he does, which is excellent. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to put it together kind of in a mixture of ways, just the ways that I feel best from all these different sources that I've kind of compiled together in my head. You know, the best way that I've found to do this. So hopefully everything goes well. It should. But all right, so one of the first things I'm going to do is clean these threads out, just because I don't know the status of them, and I want to make sure that I get any of the stuff that's in there out. So I've got my rethreading set rethreader. No, this is the thread chaser. So I'm going to run that down into each one of these holes, and I'm going to just, you know, make sure that all the stuff has been taken out of there. So this shouldn't do anything to the threads. This shouldn't harm the threads. It won't recut the threads. It's just kind of removes anything and reforms them. So I'm just going to carefully do that onto each one of these guys. They're pretty much threaded by hand. I'm just going to use this guy to kind of just lightly, they just slide right in. There's almost no friction here. This is really light. This is like, I'm barely torquing this. And this goes down here nice and deep, all the way until it stops, and I will pull this back out. And there we go. So not really anything on there, but I'm going to grab some lint-free cloths just to kind of wipe these down. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of them. All right, I got all the holes chased out, so not much on them. Obviously, they probably chased them honestly at the machine shop, but I just wanted to double check, make sure they're all clean. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and get some brake cleaner and clean all of these up. So all of this is going to get all cleaned up with brake cleaner so that it's all, we don't have any of this WD-40 on it anymore. Everything is cleaned out, especially these holes, because we have to put ARP assembly lubricant into there. And that's fastener assembly lubricant with a certain viscosity. And that's designed to make sure that you get the correct torque when you torque down the bolts on the mains, and so that when you put the studs in, they're held correctly and they have the correct amount of torque applied to them. I am going to wear safety glasses and gloves because I'm working with brake cleaner, which is not the best for you. You definitely don't want to get in your eyes. So, got a rag, clean rag, and I've got a block here. So, let's get to work. Get that under there. Clean all that out. One thing you got to be careful of is make sure that after you do this, there's no water, because this will remove any oils out of the metal, and then you won't have any protection from water. That WD-40 helps keep it from rusting, but you also don't have that protection after you do this. So just need to double check that after you do this, everything is dry. Now I'm wiping this with this rag. Obviously it's not like a special lint-free rag, but I'm going to go in afterwards and wipe this down with my fingers to make sure that there's nothing in any of these areas, and make sure that if there's any little bits of something inside of here that I get that cleaned out. But I will do that in a minute. Just Get some more brake cleaner on there and just on a clean part of this cloth and just wipe down these bearing surfaces again, make sure they're nice and clean. Also on this one, I gotta make sure I get the thrust bearing faces. I have my crappy little brush. I'm just gonna put my rag back in here and make sure that these are all clean. I'm gonna take each one of these, I'm just gonna hit it with a little compressed air while covering up, you know, the bearing and everything to dry that out really quick. I am tapping this thing with my nozzle, but my nozzle is brass, so should not cause any problems to this steel or cast iron. I have a clean area of my cloth here. Just go over these one more time. Now there are two schools of thought on this. Some people believe you should not touch the bearings, the mains, the journals, anything with your fingers. You should have gloves on at all times just because you don't want to get any finger oils into on this metal surface that's now perfectly clean. Other people say that it doesn't really matter. It's not going to be a big deal. It's going to get washed away. Technically, you know, the oils in your hand can be somewhat acidic. They can also be salty, and salt obviously causes corrosion when combined with water, you know, on these guys. So I'm just kind of doing the better safe than sorry. I'm going to use some gloves. It's not a big deal. Either way, these gloves are cheap, and you know, I might as well, especially since I'm working with chemicals. So I'm just kind of looking to see as I wipe these if there's any oils or anything on my gloves. You can see that it would show up as an oily spot. So I'm just looking, and I'm really not seeing anything. These look all very nice and clean. Okay, so next up, we've got this all cleaned out. Everything in here seems to be perfect. I'm looking for any kind of like little lint or anything like that in here, and just making sure it's wiped out. I looked down the bores into these holes, and all these seem to be clean. So we should be good for the fasteners. So next up, I gotta actually clean the bearings, because the bearings that we had in here, they got a little moist, and so I used some WD-40 on it, so I have to clean the bearings off as well. So let me do that really quick. I'm gonna do it the same way I just did this. I'll be back in a minute. All right, so we've got the block all cleaned out. Everything in here is nice and clean. We've got the bearings, they're all cleaned off, no oil in the bearings. So now the bearings got to get placed into here. And the reason why everything's got to be so clean is because any foreign object in here that pushes the bearing, keeps it from seating all the way in there, it pushes it out a little bit, it's going to get that much closer to the crankshaft, and you're going to have that much more risk of a tight crank where the crankshaft actually rubs up against the bearing as opposed to the oil film actually providing the bearing surface. So we want to make sure that these bearings seat completely into here, and that when they clamp together, those halves push fully down into these slots. So that's why I'm just, you know, double, triple checking that there's nothing in here. I'm just making extra sure that each one of these is clean. So now I'm gonna take each bearing and insert the bearing into the bore here, this journal. Okay, so starting with the rear. Got the first bearing, it's clean. And the other thing you'll notice is that the bearing has a hole in it on the back here. And that hole is for this hole right here in the block, and that's where the oil is injected into this bearing surface from the oil pump. So you definitely have to make sure that those line up. The other thing is that there's a little tang on this bearing. That tang fits into the tang slot on the engine here. And that is it, that bearing is in. So each of these should be flush, and the bottom of the bearing should seat fully inside the bore there. I'm just feeling to make sure that that is flush. A little harder to feel through the gloves, but you can feel as you drag your finger along it. You can feel if it's protruding a little bit or not, and then give it a little push. All right, so that's that. All the bearings have been installed. So validated that they're all seated down properly in there. There's no wiggle. There's no movement. These all sit completely flat inside of these bores. So now that we've got the bearings in, the next step is to oil these up with assembly lube and set the crankshaft on top of it. One thing I almost forgot to do is the thrust bearings. So this is the set of thrust bearings from Mazda. These are the OEM thrust bearings. From what I've been reading, people said it's not a big deal to use the OEM thrust bearings because they're just fine for pretty much everything that we use. So I'm just going to put these in. These have these little grooves cut into them. I don't know if you can see that with the lighting and all. There's 2 grooves cut into it. So those go facing outward, and they go right here on the number 3 bearing placement. There's a little slot for them here. Whoops. They're kind of supposed to stay, but they don't really have anything. I'm gonna put a little, lubricant on here, and that should make them stay. A little bit of this lube, really stringy and gooey. In here. All right. The surface is nice and clean. Okay. Just that one in. Double check that this is clean, nothing on there. Okay. There we go. All right, and those are both where they need to be. All right, I got the crankshaft out of the bag here, just taking a look at it. It looks excellent. There's a whole lot more holes drilled in the counterweights as well, so they clearly did a lot of balancing on this, especially this top side here. There's a whole bunch of small holes as well, so everything should be balanced pretty well. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and clean all this up really well. I'm going to go through and wipe down all the journals, make sure they're all nice and clean, there's no dirt or dust on them, and then we'll go ahead and get the assembly lube laid down into the bearings and get this thing dropped in there. Alright, so I got the crank checked out. There was a couple little areas that had some really tiny imperfections on the journals, and I just wasn't sure, so I went ahead and just hit it with some 1500 grit and mineral spirits anyway, just to make sure that there wasn't anything sticking out. That's my main concern. With the crank, I was told that it's fine if something is like sitting below the level, so if it's got like a tiny little dent in it, it's not a big deal. But if there's something protruding from the crank, so if something gets like marred into it and it pushes up like a little lip of metal, that's gonna be a problem, because that means that that's gonna run into the bearing journal. So you have to be really careful that that doesn't happen. So any of those little teeny spots that I could feel a little bit, I went ahead and just went over it with some sandpaper just to make sure, knock down any of those bits and pieces. Because I'm not sure if those happened before or after they did the final polish on the crank. Because they'll go through and they'll do a polish with a high grit belt, spinning it while it's on a lathe. You can actually see here where it's been gripped in the lathe. There's some little marks here where it was held in the lathe there. So they went and did a final polish, but I'm not sure if those little issues happened before or after that. So I just went ahead and hit them again just to make sure. So this is pretty much ready to go in now. I'm gonna go back over and start laying down some assembly lube, spread it in there, and see if we can get this thing installed. Okay, so at this point I'm gonna go ahead and start putting the assembly lube into the rest of these. Just kind of drizzle this into here. I have a mat down on the floor, kind of. So if there's anything falls through, it should kind of catch it. Basically, you're supposed to liberally use this, so a whole lot of it in there. I'm just getting this on the bearings. I'm not getting it in these holes because this is just to lubricate these bearings. It's already dripping down my leg. And not to lubricate the fasteners. That's a different lubricant and altogether, and that's got to be put on when we do that part. So I'm just going to kind of wipe this into all these bearings, make sure that those are nice and covered. These little tops as well, just in case the crank hits those. Okay. And last but not least, I do need to do these thrust washers. So I'm just going to kind of like scoop some up and just wipe it on because I've got a lot here. I'm kind of nudging these about. Let me get a little extra here. I will just go on these thrust washers, so these thrust bearings, like so. Thrust bearings they take up the thrust load. So when you push on the clutch pedal, that forces the crankshaft. The crankshaft actually moves a little bit, and that forces the crankshaft backwards against this bearing. So this bearing's purpose is to take up the thrust loads in the engine. So if you push on it on the clutch hard, if you get like an aftermarket clutch that has a really high pressure rating, and you've got, you push really hard on that clutch, all that pressure is being pushed into the engine here, and it's being pushed up against that thrust bearing, and that's what takes that load up, so it doesn't cause the crank to shift in its hole and possibly cause problems with the engine there. It could cause the crank to shift enough where it damages one of these bearings, or shifts off enough to damage one of the bearings. I'm just making sure that these are all nice and lubed. All right. I've already got the crankshaft cleaned off, so I'm going to go ahead and pick it up, bring it over, and see if I can very carefully drop it in here without breaking anything. All right. Just need to very, very carefully slide this in without dropping it or damaging anything. There we go. That's it. And all of these bearings are generating very similar patterns in the lubricant that's on here, so they all seem to be seated properly. The thrust bearings are moving a little bit, but that's because the mains aren't on yet. The caps aren't on to hold those in place. So the end plate I was talking about is almost imperceptible at this point. I can definitely see it move, but it's a very small amount of end play. So that's about it. This actually turns quite smoothly in here. I'm going to put a little more lube on here. Alright, so what I'm doing right now is I'm going to check the clearance on this front bearing, and I want to do that just to make sure that everything that I've done here, nothing has changed since from what the machine shop has specified. So what I'm going to do here is I'm putting these threaded these studs back in. I'm cleaning them up and using some of the assembly lube that came with the fasteners. Now, funny issue here. The machine shop, when they assembled it, they had to use the assembly lube that came with it, which is like this little it comes with this little pouch of assembly lube. It's just like half an ounce. So they use that when they put it together initially to do the align bore and everything like that. And they use that pouch. So now after I cleaned everything up and went to put it back, you know, put the engine back together, I don't have, I only got one of these packets, and that packet is from the head studs. So these are this is the packet from the studs that are going to be going into the head to hold the head onto the block. Since I'm not putting that on this moment, I'm actually going to use that. I'm using that packet for this to put that assembly lube back in there after I cleaned out the bores. And it's no big deal because Real Street is local and they've got some available. So I'm gonna go and pick some up tomorrow, probably after work. So no big deal, but we'll see. I mean, maybe I've got enough left after I do this to do those studs. So I'm just putting a little on there, threading it down inside that hole. And these go on finger tight. These don't go, the studs don't go in. You don't actually tighten them down. They do have a little Allen key at the top, but that's more for removal than anything. You don't actually tighten those in. You just basically, that's it, just finger tight till they go to the bottom of the bore. I'm just gonna kind of wipe up around here. It's a little bit of a mess. The other thing I'm gonna do is I gotta wipe off this area on the top of this bearing journal. I'm gonna take the brake cleaner. I'm gonna do the same clean that I did to the other one onto here. All right, I've got some green plastic gauge here, and I'm just gonna cut off a small amount of it, just a little bit. And inside this, there's a little plastic strip. Basically just open this guy up. All right, so inside of here, this little like waxy plastic strip. So this gets taken out, gets laid across the top here, like so. There you go. So with that on there, now we install the bearing, or install the other side of the bearing. So I'm gonna put a little of this assembly lube onto here. Next, I'm going to drop the bearing in. Now this cap has a little marker here, and this marker actually denotes which direction is the front of the engine. So see this little arrow here always points to the front of the engine. So easy way if you forget to put this on here. Okay. All right, I've got my 12 millimeter, kind of like star socket. It's like a 12 point. So I'm gonna run this in up to the increments that it specifies 3 increments up to 60 foot-pounds. So I'm just gonna gently kind of run these guys down here. And this is actually going to get the initial clamp onto there. This kind of pushes the main down into here and gets rid of that gap because it fits snugly down into this area here. So there's that snug. There's that snug. Okay. So I'm going to snug that up. Snug this up. There's 15. There's 15. Go up to 30. It's 30. Okay. And now we have to go to 60. And I'm reading this off the ARP instructions. So this is from ARP. This is exactly what they specify. There's 60. Supposed to do 1 pull, smooth motion. There's 60. I'm gonna loosen these up in a similar fashion. I give them that like kind of little bit at a time. Just so that they get loosened up in a similar stage setup here. All right, there we go. They should be loose now. By holding this gauge up to it and got my dirty mitts on there. Looks like we got this looks like 1.5 thousandths. So that's pretty close. The I believe the measured spec was 2 thousandths on this one, but I've also got a lot of assembly lube in there, so I'm sure that's contributing to at least a half thou worth of clearance. So this should be good. Yeah, it's kind of like right in between. Yeah, it's like 1.5. Looks like 1.5. Definitely not 1. Yeah. So it looks good. I'm gonna go ahead and continue assembling the engine then. All right, guys. So we're hitting on that 30-minute mark, and that's where I like to cut these videos off because I don't want them to get too long. They can get a bit tiring with the constant explanations and the slow pace of things, and then I'm sorry for that. But honestly, this is a tedious process. It is one that it rewards you for being exacting, for being slow and methodical, and so I've been doing all of that, and because of that, the videos are not super exciting, and I don't want to condense them down into a tiny little fraction of do this, do this, do this, because that doesn't really show you, the process of actually doing it and what it looks like, and that's really what I want to show. I want to be as boring as possible. Feel free to fast forward through these guys. I'll try to get some links in the description that'll show, some of the various spots within the video, so you can just jump ahead. Like I say, if something's boring, just go ahead and drag through that because it's a lot of the same stuff. And I try to speed it up where I could, but it's a slow, steady process, and I promise that it'll be worth it in the end. But once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.